Welcome to the channel. So, um, if you have a teen with epilepsy, this video is for you. Um, whether you're newly diagnosed or you may, hopefully this video will resonate with you. Um, and I did get my son's permission ahead of time, actually months ago, to do some videos about his condition, and I dedicate this channel to him. He's a real hero, as well as other parents out there that have a child with epilepsy or seizure disorder, and um, anything in between. So let's get started. So our journey began November 13th, 2023. So, as you know, if you live with someone with epilepsy, especially if you're a parent of a child living with epilepsy, there's two important dates. Um, the first date, it all began, unfortunately, and then the second date is the day from the last seizure occurrence. So, I can't say it's the same if you have a younger child, a toddler, or a young child that has epilepsy or seizure disorder, or even if you were diagnosed as a young adult. I can only speak from a parent perspective. I don't consider myself a caregiver. I was struggling with how to title the video, how to title the channel, and I know everybody's situation is unique, everybody's situation is different. For some, seizures can be disabling, it can be a true disability. For others, it's everybody's journey, everybody's story is different. This is my son's story. I'm just a parent of to help him manage his everyday life, to help him find seizure freedom, to find seizure control. So just I feel like he hit all the milestones, passed all the APGAR scores when he was born. Um, Other than feeling like he was hyperactive and perhaps on the spectrum when he was younger, because he was very set in his ways, wide open, so to speak. So looking back, I just we felt like we didn't have any warnings, especially early on. Like again, we saw the doctor once when he was 3, because even though he understood very well, um, he just wasn't talking. He could understand what you were saying. At the time, the doctor brushed it off and said, he was the typical 3-year old, as he was bouncing up and down in the pediatrician's office, turning the lights up and down. So he was just a lot to handle at that time. So nothing really came of that. We got speech therapy for him, and that was that. So fast forward when he's 14 years old, and he never had the best sleeping habits. And so one night we awakened to what I can only describe as the biggest thud thump. I honestly thought someone had broke into the house. And me and my husband, we had already fallen asleep. We didn't know what it was. When we woke up, we saw our son having convulsions on the bathroom floor. My husband knew immediately what was going on, even to the point of calling it a grand mal. Honestly, I'm one of those people that I thought every seizure was a grand mal. I didn't know there were different seizure types. Um, so my husband quickly jumped into rescue mode, and we call and told me to call 911. And I remember thinking at the time, as everything was happening, I remember thinking, this is going to change our lives forever. It's almost like so much happened when that moment occurred. It was almost surreal. I remember when I heard the thump and knew he had fell, it's almost like in my head, I played that we went into the bathroom, he told us he was okay, and then I helped him get up. And I'm thinking to myself, it was just so eerie. I remember thinking, did he fall a night or two before? And, you know, and we helped him get up and go to his. So it's I don't know if I was in sleep mode or if somehow, it's almost like I played that in my head before we realized something was wrong. And I remember telling my husband, "Get up, something's wrong." And that's when we ran to the bathroom. And honestly, I thought we had lost him. The seizure was that severe, in my opinion, because it took a minute before. It seemed like it lasted forever, and it took a minute before he started breathing again. The only thing I knew about seizures, and I really didn't know anything about seizures in people. The only thing I knew about seizures was in pets. I've had two dogs that had seizures. So when he started coming to the post-ictal phase, that's how I knew he was getting out of it. That weird breathing sound that they make. And I remember my one dog that had grand mal a lot. She would have that weird breathing, raspy sound, like a deep, deep breath sound. It's almost like they're sleeping but snoring and breathing heavily at the same time. I don't really know how to describe it. Well, that's what my son was doing. So I knew the worst of it was over, but he had not yet woken up. So by the time EMS came, um, they started to wake him up and started asking him the crazy questions that they ask every person that's had a seizure: who's president? I don't think they asked how many fingers am I holding up, but they asked him if he knew what happened. He couldn't remember a thing. He didn't know anything. It just came out of nowhere. Um, and I remember, for a mom, you think of everything. Even though he's homeschooled, I remember thinking, did somebody give him drugs in his homeschool? Did somebody slip him drugs in church? So that was my initial thought. Then I was thinking, was he so exhausted that he just passed out? And I remember my husband thinking when it happened, he says, I think he fell asleep on the toilet. But of course, because we were already asleep before him and we didn't witness it, we didn't know if he hit his head or anything. We did see blood um, at the base of his forehead, um, and then his chin and stuff. So when you have a seizure for the first time that you know of, when you go to the emergency room, the typical workup is to run a CT scan to rule out any brain bleeds or stroke or anything like that, and that's pretty much it. Oh, and then I think they do an EKG to rule out anything cardiac that could be contributing into it. As far as blood work, they run your typical panel. They check your sugar because sometimes diabetics can have seizures if the sugar is too, I believe, too high or too low. So you do your typical workup, and he pretty much slept the whole time we were there. So we were there about 6 to 8 hours. I actually thought he was going to get admitted. Um, we didn't even see neurology. Like I said, I think it's the typical, when the doctor comes, they say they give you what's called a one-off or a one and done. And that basically means that they basically give you a one-off seizure. They say I think 1% of the population, no, 1% of the population um, lives with seizure, has some type of seizure disorder, or maybe it's 2%, and then maybe 1% has one time throughout their lifetime, never have another one again. And of course, you always pray and hope you're that one, that anomaly that just occurs and it never happens again. And I remember us coming back home, and I remember that's when you always have the one parent that basically goes into detective mode, doctor mode. I always joked afterwards that I could be a neurologist by profession as much as I read. So I brushed up on everything. I recommend you not do that the first few days. Just the first few days, absorb what's happened to your family member before you get overwhelmed on Google, Dr. Google, so to speak, because it'll just terrify you when you read about things like SUDEP, all these different things, uncontrolled seizure disorders, seizures that are not controlled by medication. I think they call it seizure-resistant epilepsy, or people that have multiple seizure types that are hard to treat. It's just very overwhelming up front, so I recommend you not do that. Just try to absorb what happens. But I remember my main goal, my first goal in my head as a mother, was just praying that he did not have another one back to back, like a close one. Like, I read all these stories. I went on all these blogs where people were having multiple ones a week, cluster seizures back to back. But I just remember thinking, please let us just get through the first few days. And that's how our journey began. I remember sleeping on his floor for the first week, so that every time I woke up, I just wanted to be able to lay eyes on him. I just didn't know what to do. That started my 4 hour, 3 to 5 hour sleeping journeys, where as a parent, you just don't sleep well, because every time you wake up, you go lay eyes on them and all this. So that's where it began with us. Again, I felt like we didn't see it coming. Um, the only thing they told us, he could have been sleep deprived. That's the number one trigger. It's not a cause though. So it's very important that um, you understand triggers are things that can lower a person's seizure threshold. It doesn't mean that it's the foundation of what's causing the seizures, but it definitely doesn't help. So his trigger was that he was most likely sleep deprived. Again, with me homeschooling him, I always took it lightly, his sleep, because I'm thinking, okay, who cares if he's up late? And so his average sleep would be anywhere from 4 to 6 hours some nights, maybe longer. And it always has he always had a way of making up for his sleep. So even if he only slept an average of 5 hours one night, then maybe the next night or 2 nights after that he may sleep 8 to 10. So I never concerned myself with it too much until after that first seizure. So after that, it's almost like the brain resets. He was very sore for days. His body was very achy. He dislocated his shoulder in the fall, from falling from the seizure. Um, Not only did he dislocate it, he fractured it. But luckily, he didn't need surgery. It was not recommended at the time. The fracture did heal. Um, but then months after, of course, he had subsequent dislocations that just happened for no reason. We consulted ortho, and basically our only option is surgery. He did go through physical therapy for a while and things like that. So that did help, but understanding the end game will ultimately be surgery. Um, we let him decide if he wanted to or not. He decided he really didn't want to. He's an older teen. We supported that, but we know that if it starts to happen a lot, like the dislocations, I think it's been about 6 or 7 months since the last dislocation. He doesn't play sports or anything, so felt that it wasn't really something that was time sensitive or something that was needed at this moment. So we might revisit that later. But living with someone that has epilepsy or a seizure disorder, it can be very traumatic for parents. Um, you get very minimal sleep. Um, you think about things you didn't have to think about before. You're just so intentional about every aspect of your life. Driving places, what happens if it happens while you're driving in the car, um, carrying your emergency meds with you so that if cluster seizures happen or the seizure lasts longer than 5 minutes, that you have emergency backup, that kind of thing. Things you didn't really have to think about before. So initially, I was very, I don't know if the term I would say is, angry at God. Again, I know that people have it a lot harder than us. I know that some people have it multiple ones a day. Some people it's disabling. It's gotten to the point where it's disabling. Um, but I remember just thinking, why now? What? Just why, basically. And I don't think I was per se angry at God, but just perplexed, angry. You just go through these range of emotions, and then the reality of, you know, how's life going to be for my child from this point on. Things you didn't really have to think about before. Looking back, and again, this particular aspect, I can't recommend to you what to do. If you can get to the foundation of why the seizures occur and that if that foundation is something medical that can be corrected, those are the only situations I've read about. Currently, there is no cure for seizure for epilepsy. However, if there's a medical condition that is the underlying reason, then if you can correct that medical condition, then yes, you can either eliminate the seizure disorders or an epilepsy or control them where they're almost non-existent. But in and of itself, epilepsy does not have a cure. The purpose of the anti-epileptic drugs, also known as AEDs or seizure medication, anticonvulsant drugs, is just to slow down the occurrence of them happening. So unfortunately, because you cannot predict seizures, you almost feel like you're always living in the gray area. You're living in the when will the next one happen? You almost live like you're preparing for the next one. So with seizures, you can never look ahead and say, I know my next one will be XYZ. You can only look back and say, it's been this long, it's been that long. So for us, the first date was November of 2023. His last seizure was July of 2024. So it's been over a year since his last seizure. After the first one, we did not go on the Keppra right away. The practitioner gave us the option to wait, and see if he has a second one, or we could have started him right away. That will be different for everyone depending on your EEG, which is basically a test that they do of the brain to test the electrical activity going on in the brain. When they tested Pietro's, my son, it indicated that he probably would not be a one-off, that he probably was not going to be a one and done. And she put that even though he wasn't having seizures in the sleep-deprived EEG, when they basically want you to stay awake the entire night and then they see how you are sleep deprived, since that's one of the things, that's the only thing I remember telling them, is that he didn't have a lot of sleep leading into it. So they did what's called a sleep deprived EEG. And so based on those findings, she said that he most likely would not be a one and done, that his triggers would be sleep deprivation, stress, illness. There was a fourth one, I can't remember. But basically, the only thing he remembers is being tired. When I asked her if that can be a trigger, she said no, but we do try to make sure he is not overtired, because always he always pushed himself physically. So that coupled with being tired and stuff, so it's just a lot of a lot of life behaviors we had to modify. Getting at least 8 hours of sleep, going to bed consistently earlier than what he was doing, avoiding over-the-counter things like Benadryl. He has terrible allergies, so that was one thing that he always took a lot. So just having it, you're constantly researching which medications won't interfere or reduce the effectiveness of the seizure medication, which over-the-counter medications or any medications whatsoever won't lower their seizure threshold. Some medications make it more likely where they could have one, and that's Benadryl is one of them. Some cold and flu medications also, and I learned that from my aunt. But getting back to the foundation, for us, we did eventually have an MRI done to rule out any brain abnormalities, any tumors. That wasn't done till actually about a year later, because we had so much going on with physical therapy for his shoulder, counseling, you name it. It can be very overwhelming. So there was a lot going on that first year for him. So we finally he had the MRI of his shoulder done first before the brain MRI. We were going to do it together, which I'm glad we didn't, because both in and of itself is 30 to 45 minutes each. So we decided to spread it out. But the MRI did come back normal, which is great. No tumors, anything like that. But again, because of the original EEG that he had done a month or two after the first seizure, we knew that he most likely was not going to be a one and done. We celebrate every day that he doesn't have one, and even if he does, it doesn't make it a bad day. I'm on a few um, blogs and support blogs, of other parents of kids with seizure disorder or epilepsy, and I always cringe when I hear people, oh, the clock restarted, blah blah blah. And even though, yeah, in essence, you do feel that way, to me, it almost makes it as though the last, however long you went without that last seizure was done in vain. So even when he had his second one, I never said, oh, the clock restarted today or whatever. Yes, in your head, unfortunately, those, again, those are two important dates. When did it first happen? When was the last one? But I never say, oh, the clock restarted, or, we're starting over, that kind of thing. It just, I don't know, it just makes it sound like you're not thankful for the good days. And I'm not saying that's not what's going on when parents or other people say that, but for us, we just choose not to say that, because every day is a good day for us, even on days that he may have auras, days that side effects from medication and things like that. We celebrate any day that we don't have any convulsive type seizure. So this is, that's getting back to how it all began for us. And even though for us, we choose not to try to have genetic testing done at this point, or things that, unfortunately, because there is no cure, we do have hope that there will be. But again, we just choose to focus our energies on main, having good days, maintaining, limited side effects while he's on medication. But I just, for that first year, with all the appointments we had back and forth to the doctors, it was just wearing him out. So if we eventually have that done, and yet we've introduced another doctor soon, because he started experiencing sleep paralysis episodes, and usually they occur more so when he's overtired, especially when his allergies are acting up and things like that. It always happens right before he gets up, and we put that off as long as we could. Even at our last visit with neurology, we mentioned that he's been having them more frequently. But again, even though it's probably been months since we, um, in your PCP, like I said, it's just so much going on. Like, we have a very good primary care doctor who is always wanting to run his levels to make sure that she got his baseline after his first seizure. Because if you can't get into your neurology, if you can't get in to see neurology for a while, don't fret. See your PCP in the meantime, your child's pediatrician, who has been a source of relief in a lot of this. Many times your neurologist is only going to strictly speak on your seizure control and things like that. However, um, most times you will have to coordinate between the primary care doctor and neurology. I know we're experiencing a lot of side effects from the Keppra, um, and even, which is odd, sometimes his blood pressure would be elevated, and sometimes you feel like you're in a ping pong game, because you feel like you're being bounced around. Neurology would say, well, talk to his pediatrician about this. Pediatrician would say, no, talk to neurology. So a lot of times you feel like you're just being bounced around, so to speak. But our pediatrician has been a great source of comfort for us. She runs his levels. He goes in maybe 2 or 3 times a year to run his blood work to see how things are trending. So it's not so much that they just want to pick and prod, but they want to make sure things. A lot of times they'll run levels. I remember 3 days after his seizure, I was like, well, why are we, you know, of course his levels are going to be elevated. He just had a major grand mal, and so she brought up a good point. She was like, well, we want to make sure things are still trending in the right direction. They can tell a lot from blood work, especially if things remain elevated, but things have started to trickle down in the right direction. Um, but again, um, if it gives you peace of mind to get to the cause of what's, you know, to find the underlying reason of it, if you ever do. Some people never find the underlying reason. After we talk with family members, I have a first cousin that had him when he was younger, and my husband has two first cousins that are siblings that had them, that they have all grown out of it. So unfortunately, the age my son is, um, we're just not certain. There's a very small percent that teenagers do grow out of it, or They don't have as many when they become young adults. However, it's rare, and I'm not saying it's impossible. Anything's possible with God, but it's unlikely. But his cousins were younger when they were toddlers when they started having them, and the same with my cousin. So, but it does give hope if you have a younger child with epilepsy that they can possibly grow out of it. In my son's case, in Pietro's case, I'm not sure, but I will take the once a year or however. For us, I think just the fact that they're not occurring very frequently just gives me time to breathe in between and catch my breath, so to speak. Yes, I know I'm not the one living with it, and it's him. However, it does give me, it allows me to pause and keep my life somewhat normal. Um, I hope you can relate to some of this. I didn't create this channel to be a pity party, so to speak, even though sometimes you do feel that way. Sometimes, especially in the very beginning. I think the first month for me was the worst. Um, but the purpose of this channel is to raise awareness, to be a source of comfort. And if you want to share your experience in the comments, please chime down below. Um, I've always been the type of person, even when there's an issue at hand, I always feel like there's a solution. So although there's no cure for epilepsy or seizure disorder, and the reason I say seizure disorder a lot, some people have underlying medical conditions that could cause the seizures, um, but they're not necessarily epileptic. What's considered, of a person living with epilepsy. But I'm the type of person, I always believe there's solutions to an issue, solutions to a problem. So trying to live our everyday life as quote unquote normal as possible despite the condition. And I remember for the longest time, epilepsy was such a bad word to me. It just felt like a dirty word. And it took me a while as a parent to be able to say the word epilepsy. Um, but again, everybody's journey is different. If it helps you to cope better, to find an underlying reason, justification of why, if you will, then so be it. For us, it just, I didn't want to focus my energies on that. I didn't want to, if Pietro wants to find an underlying reason or feel like there's something he wants to explore, genetic testing or something like that, that's on him. He's almost a young adult. So when you have an older teen, many times we try to equip them to be a part of that decision-making process instead of just deciding for them. So every decision we've made as far as medication, counseling, you name it, everything in between, support groups, um, hanging out with friends, anything, and even driver's ed. Yes, people with seizure disorder or epilepsy can drive, depending on where you live, your state's restrictions. In my state here, you have to be 6 months seizure free. So we really need to get on the DMV ball. But you have to use wisdom. So even though I talked to the neurologist, they don't count auras or anything like that. If you are having sensations, if you're having auras that day, it might not be a good day to drive. Sometimes auras are a warning. Yes, many times they can be just standalone, even though that is in itself considered like a mini seizure. Um, but sometimes it can be a warning. Sometimes it can manifest into a full-fledged seizure. So even if it's been forever since your last major seizure, use wisdom. Um, he doesn't seem to be in a hurry to want to take driver's ed. And fortunately, I did find out that the classroom portion does not expire. However, after the classroom portion is done, in my state, they come around and then they assess, they do the vision test and then they assess to see if you have any medical, that's when you have to get the medical clearance if you do have any medical issues. So it will be 6 months from that date, even though it's been a year. He doesn't seem to be in any real hurry to drive. However, I did tell him I want him to be equipped to. I was 20 when I learned how to drive in the Army, and I told him I don't want him to be 25 one day and said, man, I wish I learned how to drive 10 years ago. So I told him, even if you don't drive, just know how to drive, know how to get yourself out of trouble. And trust me, we're looking into self-driving vehicles and everything, anything that can equip him to be safe on the road for himself as well as for others. Um, but the purpose of this channel is to talk about different things from SUDEP to driver's ed, to different things that may come up. I may even have him on the video from time to time, or even my husband, to talk about their perspective on it, what it's like to actually be the person that has epilepsy, living with this condition. I can only speak at it from a parent perspective. I don't know what Pietro's going through in his own head, like I do as a mom. You know, I know what he thinks, and I know when he tells me how he feels, but you know, I want him to do some of these vlogs with me so you can see from his perspective, not just a parent's perspective. But I appreciate you stopping by. Any particular topics or subjects you want to see covered on this channel, please chime down below. Thank you.